7:31. I will call to order the Wednesday, October 19th, 2022 meeting of the City of Falls Church Planning Commission. Mr. Trainer, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Weiss?
Here.
Ms. Teets?
Here.
Mr. Stevens?
Here.
Mr. Krasner?
I'm here.
Mr. Puentes?
Here.
Ms. Comont?
Here.
Mr. Hyra?
Here.
All right.
We have a quorum.
We got a full house. So great. All right. Well, next on the agenda is to adopt tonight's agenda. It's a relatively straightforward agenda. The main thing tonight is a work session. So, do we have a motion to adopt the agenda as it was published?
I move we adopt the agenda as published.
Thank you, Commissioner Teets. I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? No. All right. So we will proceed as published. Okay. So we have no speaker series. So that brings us to item number 5, which is receipt of petitions for items not on the agenda. So at this time, I was informed there are some members of the public that wanted to make some comments tonight. Because the T-zone work session because the T-zone text amendment is a work session, we will not, it's not a public hearing, we won't be taking formal public comment at that time. So if you're here tonight to speak about that, or any other topic for that matter, we're going to go ahead and allow that to happen now. So if there's anyone from the public that wishes to speak, do people sign up in advance, Mr. Trainer?
Yeah, we have a couple slips.
Okay, well then we'll
First is Fred Thompson,
go ahead.
502 West Broad Street, here to speak about T-zones.
Sure. All right, well, Mr. Trainer just introduced you, but if you can please, just for the record, just state your name and address, and you'll have 3 minutes.
It's Fred Thompson. I represent the Broadway Condominium Association, and I have submitted public comment on behalf of the association, both to the planning committee as well as to the city council. And my intent here is just to highlight a couple points that the planning commission
Just want to make sure that everyone can hear you.
Okay.
And there you go.
Yes, okay.
Excellent.
Can I start again? Okay, Fred Thompson, 502 West Broad Street, Unit 509. I represent the Broadway Condominium Association, and I've submitted comments to both the City Council and the Planning Commission from the Condominium Association. My goal here is just to highlight a few items that I think the Planning Commission should focus on. First of all, I think the key issue is what is the goal of the rezoning ordinance. It has been described by various ways by the City Council, and I think that's one thing that it would be helpful if you would struggle with a little bit. One is just to maximize development, maximize city tax collection. If that were the only goal, then I think this T-zone proposal as it stands would be the appropriate approach, because it takes up almost the complete areas available for T-zone, turns them into buildings, and 80% coverage, and makes them, to some degree, incompatible with local structures, but it certainly maximizes their value. But there are other things that have been out of council. I actually, in a work session, asked the council members what their objective was, and they indicated that it was to create and promote a diversity of housing options. For that, I would say right now it's harder to do housing than it is to build by right. And you might want to look at how that might be adjusted as you look at this. What is able to be built by right? If the goal is better and more housing options, maybe some of the housing capabilities on a lower scale could be built by right, and some of the other activities and some of the other functions in here might better be approached by some sort of approval process. And then finally, others have suggested affordable housing as a goal. I think if affordable housing is a goal, there needs to be much more restriction in this, because I do not see it likely, certainly in our area, that affordable housing would be the most economically viable or attractive option, and so one might want to look at that. Second, I think, what are T-zones? What actually are you trying to accomplish? And my general view of them is that they should be a step back and a step down from the commercial, so that they're a phase down as you enter residential. And I think that should be part of the planning and also what you approve. Some of the big projects, Founders 2, Founders Row, Broad and Washington have phased down to 3 stories as they hit residential houses. But it's been a process of negotiation. It hasn't really been in the rule. And I think in this case, it probably should be in the rule. And you should also focus on the fact that the city is changing when you look at what is residential. According to what I looked at the planning department data, and something like 2,700 housing units either have been added or are being added in recent years to the city. That's 5,000 people or more. And those people are residents of the city, but they don't live in single-family homes. They're going to be living in projects more like the Broadway project. And I think as you look at that, you need to look at how do we protect not just people who live in single-family homes, but how do we create buffers? How do we create appropriate buildings of scale that are appropriate for buildings in those residents, in those private buildings, not just private homes, but 24-hour residents. There aren't very many in the city that border on these T-zones, but the Broadway and the Kensington are 2 that I think you might want to consider. And so I would encourage you to look at the rules that the city has about what happens next to residential properties, because when we live in a property 24/7, we consider it our residence. We pay property taxes on it, but it's not treated as such in the city code often. Going through the T-zone requirements, the requirements for noise, lighting, setbacks, et cetera, very different for private residences and a building like the Broadway. So I would encourage you that as you go through this process, that you look at how those same sorts of rules should apply to a place where people have a 24-hour residence. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Who do we have next? Mr.
Next,
Trainer?
we have Gene Gresco, 120 North Fairfax Street, also here to speak about T-zones.
Okay.
Thanks, Jack. Yes, Gene Gresco, North Fairfax Street. I'm just coming here to maybe follow up on when the Planning Committee came to the Housing Committee about 2 weeks ago. At that time, talking about affordable units, and how to get the special permit for that if the developer wanted to do that. 2 things with that is, I don't see it listed in the current draft, but I think that should be, if they get the special permit, it should be in perpetuity. And to do that, again, I don't know how, I understand your comment, Paul, but it has to somehow involve the Housing Commission, because they know how to do affordable housing. They have programs in place. If it's apartments, the ADU program is in place, running, managed by the staff. Great job. If it's something to purchase, just instituted the program to purchase homes, be it if these are going to be condos or townhouses. So again, we have programs in place that the Housing Commission has put in place, knows how to run, is running. So that should be somehow part of the process, both in perpetuity and involve the Housing Commission. The second item that maybe look to you, Paul. Again, I look at your big headline in the 19th of September, Falls Church News Press, where it talked about the housing stock. I would just love to get that data. I'm sure you have it in multi-granularity versus just these quick footnotes here. So if you can just direct me in terms of where that exists, be it data out there, maybe previous planning meetings where it was discussed, but I didn't catch it. So again, I'd love to get that, and again, the Housing Committee would, because again, that's part of their process, right? Not just affordable, but just looking at the housing in totality. So again, just some follow-ups from that meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay. Any other speakers signed up?
No, that's all we have that's signed up.
Is there anyone else then who didn't sign up but is present and would like to speak? Okay. I don't see anybody else. So thank you. I will say, for those who spoke on the T-zones, tonight is the first of, I think, about 3. It is, at least as we have it scheduled now, 3 meetings where we'll be taking up the T-zones, at least as currently scheduled. I mean, schedules can change, but as staff has laid it out, there's, coming up next on November 2nd, there will be a public listening session, then another work session for us in December, it's on the 7th, and then tentatively taking action on the 21st. So that's the tentative schedule for now. So there'll be more opportunities to participate, provide comment, and that's what we're looking for the process to be. We wanted to provide a lot of time for the public to weigh in. We know that these parts of the city there aren't many of these lots, but they play an important role in the framework of the city, and so we actually pushed for this schedule to be lengthened from when we first heard it back in the spring to allow time for that. So we appreciate people coming out, and certainly you're welcome to stay and listen to the work session, or you can, of course, watch it online or on public TV. But thank you. So, all right, with that, then we'll move on. The only action items we have tonight, moving on to item 6A, are adoption of the minutes from September 21st. Anybody have any edits, corrections, et cetera, on those minutes? Not seeing any. That means Mr. Trainer did such a good job that they're perfect. So if there's no edits or corrections, then can somebody please provide a motion?
I move we approve the minutes from.
I'll second.
We have
Yep.
a motion and a second. Any comment on that motion? All right, all those in favor of adopting the September 21st minutes?
Aye.
Any opposed? No? Then those minutes are adopted for posterity. Okay. So moving right along, our next item brings us to our work session, item number 7, which is, of course, our T-zone text amendment. We have the staff report. I know we have Mr. Stoddard here and Mr. Trainer, so I guess we will start off with a staff summary of where we are on the T-zone project.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. If I could introduce the item briefly. So this is coming to you as a work session tonight. As you mentioned, Chair, it's been before the group previously. That was a work session back in June. But this, I hope, will be a more in-depth conversation with a more complete presentation than we were able to provide last time. Just to catch the group up on where we are, I'm actually going to jump. Actually, Jack, if you're able to load the staff report. I just want to talk briefly to the schedule and where we are in the process. Line 129. Thank you. So this has obviously been the subject of a notable council conversation going back to June of 2021. Council has hosted a number of work sessions and ultimately did grant first reading to the proposed draft text that's in front of you in your report tonight. That first reading was in May of 2022. Following immediately after that, we brought the proposed text to you in June, and it was clear from your comments that we needed to have a more complete conversation than we were initially prepared for. We have been able to staff up the effort in the intervening time, thanks to Jack Trainer joining the team, one of our staff planners. And so we are using the months of October, November, December in this proposed schedule to engage, of course, with the Planning Commission, but also the other two commissions that Council did refer the item to, those being the Housing Commission and the Environmental Sustainability Council. Jack was on with the Housing Commission last week and going to the ESC tomorrow night, where all three groups will be receiving the same presentation so that they can get the same presentation of the material, same breakdown of the component pieces and the timing and the process to date. Looking ahead, staff is proposing a series of work sessions, including a public listening session. Those signs did go up throughout the community today, with signs in front of all of the T-zoned properties throughout the city, informing folks of the upcoming listening session, which will be your next regular meeting on November 2nd. So that'll be an opportunity for you to hear, obviously, public comments that haven't already come in. Subsequent work session, and that would really be intended to craft your recommendations back to council So of course, council's referred text language out to you, and so now it's on you to make recommendations back to them. I would suggest that those recommendations not necessarily be revised text, but more along the lines of, here are the component pieces that need sort of consideration or change, or maybe some things that are worth reworking, right? It's really your recommendations back to them on their proposed text. And I would suggest using the meetings in December to finalize that recommendation and then hold your required public hearing and make that recommendation back to them in December. So that is where we are in the process and the schedule staff is proposing. But if there are any questions on process or timing, I'd be happy to take those now. Otherwise, we can flip it to Jack for the presentation on the actual content.
Go ahead, Commissioner Stevens, with the question.
Just a question, Paul, on the listening session. I'm glad that that's there. Will the format of that be any different than what we had this evening? 3 minutes, people sign up when they come, or will there be something different with this one?
The format we have that we use tonight is pretty typical. The idea, so it's, right, so obviously it's sort of the same procedurally. People have the opportunity, as they do at every meeting, to come and make public comment. The reason for branding it as a public listening session is because the level of noticing we're putting out in terms of the yard signs as well as social media posts. And really the reason for holding that at a planning commission session, right, is obviously the planning commission is representatives of the community, and so we want to make sure the public knows that their comments are being heard by someone who does have that sense of the community versus having staff directly host the meeting.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Stoddard? Go ahead, Mr. Hara.
Just about how we get the word out. I know there was some talk about getting signs down on the properties.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to maybe mail or contact the property owners? Because I think that they would be the ones that would obviously want to have some input. So I'm just wondering, have we done direct outreach to the owners of the properties that are under consideration for the zoning change?
So we know some property owners are aware of it, but no, we haven't otherwise done direct messaging, although the signs are now up on their property, but certainly we can follow up with them with direct messaging.
Yeah, I mean, just to chime in, I would, given the relatively small number of properties, it would seem that it wouldn't be a Herculean task to directly notice these folks, as opposed to maybe, if we were dealing with thousands of lots, but we're really dealing with, I don't know, if it's a few dozen, so probably better to over-notice than under in the process. But that's point well taken, Commissioner Hira. Any other comments for or questions for Mr. Stoddard at this time? If not, then I guess we're up to Mr. Trainer for a presentation.
Yeah, I'll flip it over to Jack Trainer, who's, like I said, he's giving the same presentation to all three groups so that everyone has the same information that they're working with. And so I'll leave it to Jack.
Great, thanks, Paul. Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. As Paul mentioned, my name is Jack Trainer, Staff Planner, and I'll be walking you through the proposed updates that you last saw in June. So this is just a rehashing of those kind of same updates that have been sent to you by Council for comment on. So the kind of quick agenda, we'll go through the background and why we're discussing T-zones, what are they today, what those proposed changes are, some environmental considerations, and a quick recap. So the background is that Council referred these proposed changes to the Planning Commission in February 2021, and as part of that action, Council requested planning staff to develop zoning tools to facilitate development of small residential projects on infill sites too small to support large commercial and mixed-use developments. And as part of that, staff identified T-zones as a potential solution because of their intent to serve as transition areas in the city between higher intensity commercial and low intensity single-family residential districts. The T-zone's history of limited reinvestment compared to other districts in the city, and some development challenges that have faced T-zones, such as frequent requests to rezone T-zone districts to B1 to take advantage of the special exception process. I know this map's a little difficult to see, but T-zones make up about 3% of the total land area in the city, or about 25 acres. They primarily front Park Avenue and Washington Street, with a couple pockets in the southeast area down here by the 24-hour fitness building, in the southwest, along South Washington Street. Current T-zone uses, there's two districts, and the main distinguishing trait between the two is that T1 allows single and two-family residential uses by right, whereas T2 does not. Both districts currently allow a list of uses such as public buildings, churches, schools, daycare facilities, et cetera. But the main distinguishing factor is T1 allowing single and two-family residential uses by right. This chart is kind of a brief summary of the different development characteristics and limitations on the two T zones by use. We'll get into what the proposed changes are further. So that's the summary of how T-zones are today. What I'll do next here is go through what the proposed changes are, again referred by council. The first is to consolidate T1 and T2 into a single T-zone district. The next is to remove single-family and two-family use as an allowable use, expand commercial uses, expand townhouse and multifamily uses, increase building height maximums, and expand building lot coverage maximums to 80%. So the first district consolidation, again, this would be combining the two existing T-zones into a single district. This was recommended by the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee in its final report released in December of 2010. Removing single-family use, again, this was also recommended by ZOAC in its final report, and the sort of justification or thinking would be that as a transition district, allowing a single-family use is one of the uses that the T-zone is meant to transition from. So expanding commercial uses. The thinking would be expanding neighborhood serving commercial uses as a by right allowance. Some examples listed are down here. I won't read them all, but some examples are clinics for human care and restaurants. And another proposed change is expanding townhouse and multifamily uses, currently not allowed in T-zone districts, with a noted affordability requirement of 10%. This would not be a by right use. This would only be accessible by the special use permit process, and again would be subject to 10% affordability of all units. These would also be limited to 1 acre, lots of 1 acres or less, 1 acre or less. And this chart shows what the proposed kind of new development restrictions would be. Again, to mention the 80% maximum lot coverage. That is the kind of main notable change here. The proposed kind of height maximum would be 4 stories or 50 feet. And the rear and side setbacks would be at 10% with a front, 10 feet with a front setback of 15, which is consistent with some of the current setbacks for certain uses in T1 and T2. This graphic, let's see if I can zoom in here, shows a kind of massing example of a 1 acre lot, about what 80% lot coverage might look like, with the maximum height of 4 stories here, with a 10-foot step back. And the side yard requirements that were mentioned earlier. This is in comparison to the top graphic, which shows what the same kind of maximums would be allowed today on a T1 or T2 lot. And then we have a couple slides here about some environmental considerations. T-zones do not have impervious maximums or any kind of limitations to that effect. They would follow what the city's kind of standards are, complying with Section 35.6 of the code, which dictates redevelopment water quality and quantity. And a similar story with urban forestry, where T-zones would not have, or don't have as a proposed amendment or change, its own urban forestry requirements. They would follow current city guidelines. And the parking lot details and parking lot landscaping are listed here because parking lots are a current by right use in the T-zones. Off-street parking requirements, similarly, no proposed code changes to the T-zones. They would follow what's already in place with the code. Of note, council is working on reviewing multifamily parking requirements and minimums, which could impact T-zone development. So to recap quickly, why T-zones? T-zones are meant to serve a transitional use between higher intensity commercial districts and low intensity single family, and to provide pathways for reinvestment to improve aesthetics, streetscape, and infrastructure. And the proposed T-zone updates, again, one more time, to consolidate T1 and T2 into a single T-zone, remove single family and two family uses as allowable uses, expand commercial uses in T-zones, expand townhouse and multifamily uses, increase building height maximums, and to expand lot coverage maximums to 80%. So that concludes the kind of recap presentation here. Chair, I'll give it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Trainer. I guess with that, we'll open it up to commissioners for questions or comments for staff on this project. So I guess, Mr. Trainer, just to sum up, so from what we saw over the summer, I know we looked at it. I don't know if it's been back in front of council and some other groups. Have there been did you highlight in here any other changes that have occurred since then? Or is this the same draft that we saw at that time?
These are the same. Yeah, the same ones. My understanding is that you last saw these in June, after they were referred out by council, and nothing's changed since then. This is just a reminder of what those were, since it's been a couple
months. But I just wanted to confirm that. Okay. All right, well, then again, commissioners, it's, who would like to start off? Anyone have any comments or?
I can start off.
Sure, go ahead, Commissioner Teets.
So I've seen the graphic you guys used on slide 14 before, like where it shows the 80% massing and everything. But I'm wondering, have we tried to spec out, so we're going to follow the stormwater, regulations and the urban forestry and the parking with all the vegetation that needs to be in a parking lot, any buffers in a parking lot. Have we tried to spec out what these potential projects are going to look like? Like, how are they going to meet all these requirements? I don't see how you can meet some of the tree canopy, I guess, with street trees, but I mean, it's just going to be, like, in park, and I mean, they may or may not have parking lots, I imagine, but still. Have we really looked at what something like this would look like?
I don't know that staff has done an analysis on a per lot or per assemblage basis. The thinking is that staff still plans to get in touch with some folks in the building community for some feedback about the feasibility of what's being proposed, and take stock on what the proposed restrictions, how that would impact, the attractiveness of T-zones for development.
Yeah, because I'm kind of concerned about that. I'm also concerned because I think, I mean, obviously, the example you guys are showing is just gray box, so it doesn't really mean anything. But I really think that before we get to December, I'd like to have the public be able to see examples more sketched out than this. Of what something, like, if it's an 80% coverage townhouse community, how are they doing the parking? Where would this parking be? How are they going to do the stormwater? Because obviously, when you're going to have that much impervious surface, it's, normally when we do like development, especially like if we're doing a mixed use, we know that when it's done, sometimes it even has less impervious surface because some of these lots are wholly paved. And then we go in and we actually get additional open space that we didn't have before, even though it seems bigger. And we know all the stormwater could be dealt with. But in this case, we have lots that are going to go, that have pervious, that are going to go completely impervious. And I'm just curious how does this all work, that we deal with all the stormwater, we have all the parking regulations, we meet our tree rules, and we're going to be affordable. And I think that before we pass this, we really need to know that this can actually happen. And so I would just say that, I would accelerate talking to builders and just say, given this, what do you think you can do? Just, even if it's just a rough estimate, I'd just like to see something. Because right now, I just don't see how this works. And I'm a little concerned about the environmental impacts of it. I'm concerned that we're not going to get affordable housing. I mean, we might get a mix of housing. I don't think we're going to probably get commercial because commercial is not big right now. So what does townhouses look like that? What does a small condo building look like on there? That's what, and I think without I know that we're not agreeing to a specific project per se, but in a way we are saying we're agreeing to a certain kind of project look on lots of different lots around the city. And even at the very beginning of a mixed use, we get some kind of sketch, even if it's just kind of a feel for it. So I just don't think, I think it's just very hard for people to envision. And I'm just finding it hard to envision how this happens with everything intact and not being, I don't know, overly masked, environmentally friendly, and affordable. And mostly for me, if you can tell me, guaranteed we'll get some affordable housing out of it, I think it's worth it. But it's kind of listen to that missing middle that Arlington's going through. And they're talking about, you build these extra houses in someone's backyard and you're going to get this missing middle. But those houses are super expensive. They're not even close to affordable. And so if we go through all this and we don't get some affordable housing, it'd be pretty sad.
So, Commissioner, if I could interject. And I'll take these in reverse order. So on the affordability component, the draft text that was referred out to you, the only pathway for a developer to access the multifamily housing or the townhousing is to include 10% of the units as either affordable or workforce. So that is the only path to get an entitlement. You can't seek a variance for something like that. So that would be the only path.
I guess what my thing is, I'm not sure they can actually build a project, get that affordable in there,
Right.
and meet all these regulations. And that's what I'd like to know. Is it doable?
Right, and I think you're right to ask for that truth testing with the industry, and obviously we'll complete that outreach, and I think probably asking several different developers to get their take on, could you do something like this? What would this look like? Because obviously people are going to have different expertise and different kinds of projects, so we want to get different takes on it. and then sort of working backward through the questions, example projects, we've started to build a catalog of these. Some of these are sort of very large acreage. Some of these are smaller acreage. But Jack, if you're able to go into the attachments of the example regional projects, and I don't actually want to go through all these. I just want to jump to the most recently added example if we go all the way down to the bottom. So this project is the Avant, and right, not all buildings come in the same colors, right? So, and they can be styled differently, they can be use different materials. So what I don't want to point out is sort of the styling and the features, but more so how it sits on the lot, approximately how large it is, thinking about the envelope of the building, and then how it accommodates things like site access. So this is a project that's near, sort of south of Roslyn, in nearby Arlington County. And I think we probably have the acreage in a summary table. It's about 1/4 of an acre, it's 12 units, and the building is either sort of 4 or 5 stories, depending on how you count it. There is some below-grade parking that you can access via it's under construction now, so this is a rendering, but there's a garage to access below-grade parking, and then there's a number of units on each of the floors. And I'm going to assume, based on the round number of units, that all the floor plans are the same, just stacked one on top of the other. But I think
Do you know if they're going to include affordable housing into this building?
I don't know that. We were able to pull some summary statistics, like I said, sort of the acreage and
Right.
the number of units, but the programming of the units themselves, we don't have that at the time.
While you're researching that, it'd be interesting to know what the rear setback is on that, just for context, since we're talking about the 10 feet.
Right, they're tight, and so we can try to pull that as well. And then just going back one more in terms of environmental concerns, I think stormwater would probably, stormwater quality is going to have to be met on site, or I'm sorry, quantity is going to have to be met on site, the runoff sort of flooding prevention. I imagine a lot of that is going to be done with underground detention, and the stormwater code today, you can't increase runoff from what's happening today. So that is the code protection. And then what was the other one? Oh, tree canopy. So the canopy requirements, interestingly, for the city's T zones and B zones are actually fairly limited. So there are requirements for buffer strips along the edge of the properties when you're adjoining a different zoning district, and then also required landscaping for parking lots. But those are the only requirements on the books today. There aren't overall canopy requirements for sites.
Okay, anyone else have any other comments they'd like to share? Anyone? Go. Mr. Fuentes? Thank you.
I'm glad we're looking at this. I think this is an important thing for us to be taking a look at. I know that a bunch of other communities around the country are looking at, I think they call them local serving zones in a couple of different places. Maybe you've seen these. So I'm glad that we're looking at it now. These are dead zones right now, as far as I'm concerned, really underutilized, and the ability to make something more vibrant and better for the city, I think is a really good idea. I absolutely share Commissioner Tietz's concerns. It does feel like there's a lot in here that a developer is going to have to adhere to. The parking is a big one. I think I would really like to see, or I wonder why we didn't take a look at maybe reducing some of the on-site parking, because I do think we're going to have some of the problems that Ms. Tietz ran into, with the impervious surfaces. And I think this is a good opportunity. We've talked a lot up here on the dais about the outdated parking requirements we might have for some of these projects. And so I'd like us to see if we could take a look at that. Maybe there's some opportunities there to make some of these projects more feasible or make it easier for some of the stuff to get done. There's also a lot in here around drive-throughs, which doesn't seem to be consistent with some of the things we've talked about for the vision for the city, particularly in these T-zone spots. It looks like it's leftover language. I don't know if it's just combined from the two different T-zone proposals, but I really like to see maybe taking that out. I don't think drive-throughs in any form would be really conducive for the things that we've talked about up here. So I'd like to see us take a look at that. And then also maybe something around connectivity. I don't quite know how to articulate this, but you have the Madison townhouses as one of the examples in the materials. And I think we really missed an opportunity there to connect Park Avenue to Broad Street. I know there was some opposition to making that go all the way through, but it'd be really great if some of these parcels could be more well integrated into the fabric of the streetscape than being kind of isolated chunks kind of all along Park Avenue, especially while we're doing the great streets and all the other stuff we're doing here. So I don't know what the right metric is, but some measure of connectivity to the network, I think, would be a good opportunity here. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I could just clarify
ahead.
on why there is sort of large volumes of text around drive-throughs. So there was existing, so the mechanism that's been referred out for approval is what's called the special use permit, and the regulations surrounding considerations for special use permits lives in the supplementary regulations of the city zoning ordinance. And for the most part, SUPs are generally approved by the BZA. This one is one that council wants to reserve authority to itself. And when staff got into that code, we found that over time it had been glommed onto over time. And so we did, in consultation with the city attorney, come away with a recommendation to actually split that out. So part one is all those things related to council approvals. Part two is all those pieces related to the BZA approvals. And in separating that out, we ended up having to essentially cut all the code from one section and copy and paste it back in. And so that's why if you compare the blue text that's being added and the red text that's being removed, they're word-for-word replacements. So the intent was to leave it alone, but the only way to leave it alone was by copying and pasting it. And your point about connectivity is a good one. Occasionally on the bigger projects, we've been able to get pedestrian connectivity. We got it with Founders Row, Founders Row 2. Well, both of them provided new street connectivity. And then also the Spectrum building does provide a difficult to find, but a passage way from Broad to Park Avenue. And I think that's a good point about finding ways to make those connections.
Commissioner Stevens, go ahead. Oh, Harry up first. I'm losing track of who's in what order. But go ahead, Mr. Harry.
All right. Yeah, I think this is an interesting set of, or a proposal with all the development that we have going. It makes sense to have transitions going from some of our high-rise mixed-use development down to the single-family. But I'm hoping that we can get affordable housing if we go forward with this. And Commissioner Tietz's point, I think, is really good. We have all these requirements that it might make it very difficult for affordable housing to be executed. I'm thinking that we likely will need to find a funding mechanism to provide incentives for developers to do affordable housing if we really want affordable housing. So I highly suggest that we, as planning commissioners, consider thinking about how to pair this policy with a funding mechanism. If we want affordable housing. I very much so want affordable housing. But I think, Paul, when you go back to developers, they're going to tell you, yeah, we can do this affordable housing if you put it there, but then the other condos or the other rentals, they're going to jack up the price. So we might get a little bit of affordable housing, but the rest of it will be very expensive, and I think that's a missed opportunity. And I would hate for us to sort of change this zoning and then have nothing happen. So we really need to be strategic with it, because I think if we do this zoning change and we don't really put the right requirements, is we're just going to get a bunch of expensive multifamily units. And I don't think we really want that. That's a missed opportunity. So that's just one general point. Another is, we talked about transitioning down, and actually we're increasing the height. And I would love to hear staff's rationale and reasoning. While existing it's 3-story, we're talking about transitioning down, and then we're going to 4 stories. We're adding more. Is that because the multifamily or the mixed use is so high that we want something even higher than what is there? So that's just one thing. The other thing is that we talked about doing away with the single family. Why wouldn't we just have all these different uses as part of this package and not remove single family? I think that's a real big stick to basically say if there's single family there, well, maybe they'll be grandfathered in, I don't know, but then no more single family on these units. If I was a property owner, I would be really concerned. So instead, it might be keep existing single-family, keep existing duplexes, and add the 80% coverage, to have all of these uses possible within this plot. So, again, I know we have goals and we want to get certain things accomplished, but I think it's a very heavy policy tool when you wipe out an existing use altogether. But I think we can debate that. I also would be interested is, mostly zoning comes from planning. It's from planning commission, planning staff. It appears again that this one has come to us from council. I'm interested in who actually proposed this to council. We have some of the history here, and Jack, thank you for giving us this great presentation. But who proposed this? It sounds like probably developers proposed it because they think instead of a single use, you could have a multi-use and cut up the lots and make a lot more money. So I would just love to know more about the history of who has proposed this. And I think pairing that also with who actually owns these plots. I said we should do outreach to the owners. We also should know on Planning Commission who owns these lots. Because this decision to change this changes the economic value of these lots. So who's got an economic interest? I think that would be important for us to know as we move forward with this policy. So those are just some of my comments. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, property ownership is always public record. We can, of course, pull that. It's available today for anyone on the city's property tax maps. In terms of sort of going sort of backward through the comments, or working in reverse, I guess, in terms of the proposal, it did come from staff. So there's more detail on this in the staff report. But it's on line 64 of the staff report that when council amended the SE code in February of 21, they did ask, so the SE code that was being changed was to move from the net new commercial requirement for major mixed-use projects to a significant new commercial component. It's a rewording, but it opened the door for a wider variety of mixed-use projects. At the time of acting on that, council did direct staff to find a pathway or come back with a pathway for an all-residential project. And so staff did look at what was on the books and available under the various zoning districts and the zoning ordinance, and staff did identify T-zones as one of those zones that might be worth considering, and it was specifically for the reasons that Jack identified, that it's not really serving as a transition between the two districts, single family and sort of mid-rise multifamily and mixed use. And also there's been a relative lack of major investment in the T-zones. If you look back in the city 15, 20 years, obviously there's been redevelopment in the commercial zones. That obviously captures the paper headlines a lot of times. And single family has also been redeveloping at a pace of somewhere between 15 to 20 single family teardowns every year. But T-zones have largely been left sort of unchanged. In fact, when people do develop T-zones, it's because they're able to get a rezoning to be and access the SE process. And so staff suggested to council that there should be some other pathway for these T-zones to develop. And then you're right, that the mechanics of sort of the specific proposal did evolve over those 4 work sessions with council. And that's how the proposal landed on where it is. In terms of the single family, staff may have been sort of the biggest pusher of this idea of removing single family from the T-zones. It hasn't happened in a while, but it was 10, 15 years ago that were a couple T-zones that developed as single family by right. And I think one of the concerns staff is thinking about is that if single family is accessible as a by right use and multifamily is available but only through a special use permit, the potential return of creating a single family house compared to the time involved in securing the special use approval, it may be that even if the larger building nets more revenue, the longer time it takes to access it makes that single family house look very attractive. So the concern is that single family would actually economically outcompete the multifamily buildings.
Just a follow-up to that, how many single-family homes do we have on the T-zones currently? Do we know, like, what percent are single-family homes?
So there's a mix. If you look at the buildings that are out in the T-zones today, there are some buildings that are actually pretty large buildings, right? Like Columbia Baptist Church and the Kaiser are both very large buildings. So not counting those, you're largely looking at the strip of smaller buildings along North Washington, as well as the east side of North Washington, as well as the south side of Park Avenue. And a lot of those buildings are either very small condo office buildings, or they're either newer single-family houses or older single-family houses that are being used as professional offices. So it's a mix, but it's a probably relatively small portion are being used as private residences. But we have heard, another thing that motivated staff's recommendation for the T-zones is that we were at the time getting a lot of calls from property owners or leasing agents on behalf of the property owners asking what their options were, because their properties were sort of coming of age where they couldn't afford to reinvest in the money for what they were going to get back in terms of lease payments. And so they were exploring their redevelopment options. And so long as single family remains a buy right option, that might be the best path available to them.
Let's see, and I'll just, real quickly, I'll chime in and then I'll throw it over to some other folks. I mean, first of all, thank you, staff, for the work you've done on this. I think I said this back in the spring, and I'll say it again. Because we're talking about such a small number of lots, I mean, I still think that, I'd be looking for staff to provide a little more of a fine-grained analysis of what, the changes might yield or what's possible. I mean, we have so few of these lots, but they do vary in size and in context. I mean, to me, there's a big difference between, the lots on Park Avenue and the lots that are on North Washington Street, even though they're both Zone T, whether it's T1 or T2. I think it would be helpful to know, the sort of the different lot sizes, right, which ones are in common ownership. I mean, I think encouraging consolidation of some of these parcels is the only way we're going to get some of this. And I don't see any kind of incentives in there for, encouraging consolidation of these smaller lots to, yield, critical mass that might, provide for what we're looking to do. I mean, I also see kind of and I know the history a little bit. I mean, I know it goes back to the ZOAC report. I mean, there's still relevance to that report, but it's getting a little long in the tooth, so for us to be referencing recommendations that were made from 2010, some of those are still very valid, but, there are the city continues to change and evolve, and I don't know if hanging our hat on a group of, made up of folks from, back in 2010, some of which maybe live here still or don't, or, I just think it, it's getting a little old to refer to that as our guide, for the changes. I mean, I know staff's looked at that independent of that, but I see reference to that a couple times in the report, as well. ZOAC said we should do this, so therefore we should do it. So, I mean, I really do think that it's not a heavy lift to really look at these lots pretty much individually and see what would, as you said, some are developed with Kaiser or Columbia Baptist. I mean, those aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So you kind of take those off the table and you kind of really look at what's left and look at the potential, which ones are really based on their assessments versus their land, of the built, structures versus the land value. I mean, what are we looking at? And where is, but yeah, to me, I see a difference in the kind of the transition that we're looking to achieve on Park versus the transition on North Washington. I think they're very, very different contexts. So, I think I don't know if we can handle it all in one fell swoop. And luckily for us, it's a small number of lots in a small area, so I think we can dig a little, go a little more fine grain and really try to tease out what we're looking to achieve that's realistic. Seeing like, I think also they're very disparate, allowing commercial, and townhouses. I don't know. I think we should also maybe be a little more clear what we're looking to favor here. Are we looking to favor a non-residential use over residential? Are we really looking to have more of a residential transition? It's just a very different character to have like a restaurant serve as a transitional use versus townhouses. And maybe on North Washington Street, the restaurant is appropriate. Maybe, on Park, maybe a little less so. I don't know. So I think we need. It's a long way of saying I think we need a more fine-grained look and analysis at this area to really understand and have a better sense of what would make sense to encourage it. I think we all agree that very little has happened on these lots over the last, 10 or 20 years, and that's a problem. They are an underutilized asset, but what are we looking to achieve? If it's affordable housing, well, then maybe we need to, again, look for ways to encourage that more directly in the ordinance than the current draft gets at, perhaps. So anyhow, that's kind of my 2 cents. Let's see, go ahead, Ms. West.
Yeah, that sort of tees up one of the requests I was going to make is, number one, can we get an analysis of the current state? What's the current inventory, age, tax assessment? Number one. Number two, for each of these T-zone areas. Number two, what does the future state look like? I think part of that is maybe conversations with builders. What's the possibility for consolidation? What is the commercial potential in some of these areas? And just kind of remind us what we've said as a city that we want in each of these areas, just from our small area plans, right? So I think that would be helpful to put all of this in context. And I've got some questions. Number one, in terms of connectivity, which I think is a very good point, how would our streetscape standards apply to these T-zones? Would they help provide that connectivity? And what expectation would there be for development in these T-zones? Number two, how do we get to the 10% ADU, 10% affordable in the context of the types of development we think we'll see here? In other words, if we see a duplex, what does 10% mean? If we see something with 12 units, what does 10% mean? Like, how did we get to that number, the 10%? Number three, and I guess the last one is, well, I guess, actually, so 2 more questions. Number one, why consolidate all of these? Well, I guess I'm just thinking, I guess I can see why we would call all of these one zone, T1. But considering we might be trying to achieve different objectives in different places, is there benefit in zoning them differently? And then the last piece, which kind of relates to that, is how are we balancing the objectives that we're trying to achieve as a city? We want more affordable. We want to manage stormwater. We want more trees. We want more open space. Is there a way, and we think we want to favor more housing diversity without having single-family homes be the easiest, lowest hanging fruit, because that doesn't achieve our objectives. Is there a possibility that, for example, along Park Avenue, we have one set of objectives, and along Lee, we have a different set of objectives? And how do we balance, more specifically, right? So we've got 4 stories. I can see why there might be height concerns in some areas. At the same time, we've got 80% lot coverage. Has there been any consideration of, if you want 4 stories, let's do less lot coverage? In other words, the incentive for height is more green space or more trees, because maybe in Park Avenue, we want more green space. Or maybe in Park Avenue, we want the lower, level homes. I'm just, because, the administrative burden of having different objectives might be high, I get that. But these are really sort of bespoke little pockets of the city, and can we be a little bit more fine-grained, as Chair Krasner said, in terms of the objectives that we're trying to achieve?
So one, I can answer right off the bat. You mentioned the question about streetscape standards, and that is, if we're able to pull up line 367 in the staff report. Is there a way to zoom in? There we go. So these are the, so this section of the proposed code is zooming in on the considerations that council would have to take the items council would have to consider in reviewing an application for a townhouse, right? So such use shall comply with the following regulations and with any other conditions stipulated. Townhouse, apartment, condos in the T district, in addition to any other requirements. This is where the 10% affordable is a requirement. It would also have to enlarge the city's tax base, line 375, and I think that would be running the fiscal impact analysis. Line 376, promoting environmental stewardship, and then 377, heighten architecture, provide harmonious transition, and then also meeting the city's urban design and streetscape standards. So that would be a requirement. One thing to caveat is that with a smaller project, I probably wouldn't expect them to underground the utilities if there are any along the frontage. It's very difficult to underground 1 or 2 poles at a time. But certainly in terms of the width of the space, as well as the layout of that space in terms of the pedestrian clear space, building space, and amenity zones, I would expect to have that with any of these projects. Your point about sort of different goals, I think that's a good one. We can pull the goals or in the city's small area plans and try to summarize those when we bring this back to get really a sense of sort of what are the city's planning goals for Park Avenue as well as North Washington Street. I'm a little hesitant to think that they might be, obviously we'll pull the plans and confirm, but I'll say I'll sort of acknowledge sort of a bias up front. I've got to imagine that the areas are so close to each other sort of geographically, and Falls Church is sort of small enough that sort of the difference from sort of one side of town to the other side of town it's not the same as going from one side of Fairfax, right? It's not Eastern Loudoun versus Western Loudoun. So I would hope we could find sort of one set of rules that are sort of generally applicable throughout the city.
I want to just push back on that just
Yeah.
a little bit, because Park Avenue has a very different feel from North Washington Street.
Right.
Right, so and to, Commissioner Teets, a couple other comments about, like, can we achieve all of this in one place? Like, is there a way to simplify the expectations? Like, if we think we want townhouses, for example, along Park Avenue, can we just simplify the expectations to make it easier to get the townhouse there? And for example, if we think we would rather encourage commercial along Lee Highway, can we simplify the expectations to encourage that? Like, do we want everything in all places? I mean, I also know we want to let the market decide and figure out what makes sense, but.
Sure. I mean, the other way to approach that would actually just be sort of rezoning the property altogether, right? If North Washington wants to have sort of, or the community vision is sort of mixed use and commercial, then does it make sense to actually just sort of proactively rezone the property to be B1, or I think B1 is probably the recommendation in the small area plan ultimately, because council would still be holding sort of the entitlement keys in the sense that the special exception is still required, whereas when you leave it in T, you may actually send mixed signals to the development community. So there is sort of a risk in leaving sort of land zone not necessarily consistent with your vision. So it may be a better move just to consider rezoning the property in the first place.
Sorry, can you just say a little bit on the 10%, just in the context of what we think we're likely to get?
Sure. So 10%, so just first in the calculation, so whenever we get a larger project, it's always, the baseline is 6% at 60% AMI, and that 6% is always rounded up to the next whole number, right? You're not going to make a portion of a unit affordable. So on a larger project, the calculation is to round up to the next whole unit. It is harder when you're talking about a much smaller number, and I think that is something that we'd want to understand from the development community about how would you expect to approach that. The other thing that may be worth considering on a smaller project, but obviously this is a community conversation, is about whether it might make sense to have some sort of cash in lieu option. In case it is difficult to either fit a fractional unit or it's hard to run a building with only one affordable unit versus a larger single component. So that might also be something worth considering.
Commissioner Stevens has been very patient.
Thank you. I think there's merit in the argument that it's a different situation to put the, I'll call it burden, but I don't mean that in a negative sense, of funding affordable housing when you are talking about a project that may have 10 to 20 units versus one that has 350 units. You know, that becomes, you know, a far different consideration, and it may well be that we have to think about, and I would certainly encourage thinking about some kind of external funding, that is to say, external to the project, as making more sense in this smaller residential preference that we would like for the T-zones. Then I'd like to probe a little better, perhaps, Paul, have you share your thoughts regarding the table that you put at line 122 of the staff report that compares the timeline for special exception versus the special use permit. And it shows a difference of maybe 3 months as far as the time goes, which, you know, is not dramatic. So, you know, you would look at this and think there's not much of a difference. But if you look at the financial side of this, if I understand it correctly, there'd be, you know, significant difference between these two columns in the sense that with the special exception, if that's the route somebody wanted to go to and use for a T-zone project, they're going to have to come in, and I think, as you indicated, they're going to have to request a rezoning unless they want to just automatically provide the 10% housing. But if they don't want to, then they're going to have to request a rezoning to B-zone. And then they're going to have to make sure they meet the primary and secondary criteria. And they're going to have to negotiate and contribute under voluntary concessions. So hopefully I've got that right. The question I have, though, is on the special use permit, how much of that would carry over, you know, this financial side would carry over to the special use permit side, or is all of that basically not applicable?
So smaller projects do have sort of a disproportionate cost for soft costs, things like attorneys' times and associated legal fees and engineers and architects' time, right, that you know, you pay your attorney the same hourly rate whether they're representing you on a half-acre case or a 4-acre case. There's no discount there. So I think the cost for these projects is going to be high. There was and I'll say I don't know that council is comfortable with sort of the length of time required to get to an approval for these SUP projects. I think there were some concerns from council members about just sort of the length of time required to get through the proposed entitlement process. In those series of work sessions, we had explored other options for things like by right approvals and other zoning entitlements that might be available. And ultimately, this is sort of where the conversation landed with this SUP approval reserved to the council, but still wanting to get sort of a thorough or a fair community review with Planning Commission and AAB involvement. And so that's how we ended up with sort of the, you know, and this may turn out differently in reality, but thinking through, you know, one submission to present to council, probably a revised submission to share with relevant boards and commissions, and then probably a third submission required to get through the council approval process. And so I think when you start to stack them up, you do get to a fairly lengthy process, and I think applicants would be shouldering quite a cost there to get through that.
As far as the voluntary concessions and the financial element of that, how much of it is shed by going to the special use permit? Will council, for example, will they be able to negotiate voluntary concessions, or will they have the right to negotiate some type of financial, you know, contributions towards capital costs, that sort of thing, or is all of that basically gone with the special use permit approach?
So that was certainly, I think, the intention of staff in clarifying what are the considerations for a special use permit, that would essentially preload that conversation, right? So that if somebody's coming in, they've got a property less than an acre, they're already Zone T, they're going to provide the 10% affordable housing, they're going to provide the streetscape, they're going to provide a quality finish on the exterior of the building, that I think the expectation would be you've sort of met the tests
met your
here,
burden.
and you should be able to move through the process. Now,
Yeah.
that being said, every project is unique, and how the architecture is crafted on one parcel versus another may be different. based on sort of where it is and what the adjoining existing uses are, and whether that allows for a consolidation of nearby properties. So obviously, every property is unique, but there was an attempt, at least by staff, to clarify what are the hurdles to overcome.
But the short answer, I mean, there's no voluntary concessions on a special use permit,
Correct.
just development conditions. So.
Right, so
yeah,
there's
yeah.
a big difference between these two columns when it comes to the financial side. So I guess that was my main point.
Right, and with the SUP as proposed, there's no requirement to provide a commercial component, which is certainly a big release for these properties.
Right. I think one other thought, as far as, even though there aren't that many lots here that we're looking at, some people have kind of questioned why spend so much time on this, but I think one way that it could be helpful, that you might want to mention in a future staff report, is that it could serve as a guideline for other situations where residential units, bump up against commercial development, where you've got residential, standalone residential, townhouses and so forth that back up to a B zone. And if the B zone redevelops at some point, there's no transition zone there to protect those particular residential units, but they may look back to this project here, this change here as guidance, for how to deal with those project renovations in the future. So just a thought. A couple of concerns that I have as I go into this. I'm still open to, kind of reaching a conclusion, but I am concerned about the 80% lot coverage. That just seems to kind of eviscerate the role of these T zones as indeed a transition zone. It just seems like a big jump from where we've gone up to that 80%. I mean, in other contexts, 80% may be fine, but if it's going to continue to function as a transition zone to buffer commercial to residential, then it strikes me, at least at this stage, that the 80% is pretty big. Likewise, the 10-foot rear setback strikes me as kind of taking it out of my comfort zone for it to continue to function as a transition zone. So just a couple of thoughts there, and that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Stevens. Mr. Comment. She hasn't spoken yet. Look at him.
Did you want to follow up?
Go ahead.
No, if you want to follow up on something he said, go ahead.
It's probably a longer question.
Thanks very much for putting all this together, Mr. Trainer and Mr. Stoddard. I agree with a lot of the things that all of my colleagues have said so far, particularly the different contexts on Park Avenue and on North Washington streets. It's an interesting idea to potentially rezone some of those parcels on North Washington. I see in the future land use map that some of them are already contemplated, I think, to be business parcels in the future. Is that correct? Yeah. So maybe that's an idea that's already been discussed. Imagining townhouses on North Washington, it just doesn't seem like that's really what we want to use those parcels for, whereas they feel appropriate on Park. I think one of my concerns, I share Mr. Stevens' concern about the lot coverage. 80% does seem quite high, and the setbacks seem pretty small at 10 feet. Another concern I have is, the fact that we're removing all by right residential development ability from the existing landowners. I wonder why something like townhouses would need to go through a special use permit. If it's just houses, I presume that they would be 35 feet, which is the limit for most residential houses, if it's not a multi-unit building. I wonder if we could include something like that as a by right option so that these landowners would have an ability to develop their lots in a way that we find acceptable. I think also something like cottage courts could be considered. They seem to have like a similar number of units per acre as townhouses, so we may be able to get a little more density with those. Also things perhaps like quads, sixplexes, eightplexes, these are being built all over America right now, so it's a lot happening. All of those things seem like something that you could see on Park Avenue, depending on the lot size. A little concerned about the lack of impervious requirements or tree canopy requirements. I don't know if, maybe my colleagues know more about sort of our stormwater mitigation requirements and these sort of technical tree requirements, but it seems like, if these are intended to be transitional but largely residential properties, like why wouldn't we have the same kinds of requirements that we have for our residential property owners here? So I don't know if it's possible to create those, but maybe that's something we could consider. The parking is much too high. I don't understand. I'm glad that council is going to be looking at these parking requirements. It's a mystery to me why somebody living in a townhouse needs 2.5 spaces, whereas our single-family homes only need 1. So yeah, those need to be right sized, but I think my understanding is that that's in the out years. And so, if we're going to make changes here now, that seems like something that needs to be addressed. And yes, I think a cash in lieu option for the affordable would work. In general, I think, the goals here are to encourage slightly denser housing in these areas, more diversity of different kinds of housing, and a wider variety of price points. That should definitely include affordable so far as that's possible, practical, legal for us to require it. But I think also, being able to create different kinds of housing, not all of them hopefully will be multi-million-dollar houses, which is all really that's being built now all over the city. Any new property that's going up is 1.6 million minimum. So if we're talking about building, smaller multi-unit buildings, those units are necessarily going to be less than that if we're talking about a similar size lot. I think that is all that I had. Thank you for the signs. I'm really glad that you're getting the word out to the public, and that's a good way to do it. Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, I can't take credit for that. Jack figured out how to order them and worked with OCOM to get them designed. They did a great job with the designs, and he was out there today sticking them in the ground. So I'm glad they're well received. The credit should go to Jack.
See, I would also just caution, talking about townhouses, allowing them by right. I will say that the market, the appetite for townhouses is strong. That continues to be strong, and I think that would be the path of least resistance for many developers. And they likely would be, it wouldn't certainly be affordable. They'd be more affordable than a detached single family on a quarter or a third of an acre, but, they wouldn't be affordable. And that seems to be what, given left to its own devices, that's what you might see a lot on these properties without incentives for other things, either through density or through other things. So it's something to keep in mind about, opening up the lots to townhouses by right, because you would probably begin to see most of them turn over to townhouses. I would suspect. Go ahead, Ms. West.
I guess that's, to the point of what are we trying to achieve here. I think there have been some really good points about, needing to make more space for affordable. And the process can be timely because you don't get a discount for a, quarter acre unit versus 4 acre. Special use permit still costs money, even though it's cheaper than a special exception. If we're trying to look for more affordable housing, can we just streamline and simplify our expectations around this and take some of the objectives, such as, throwing this out there, like multifamily can be built by right if it includes, 10% affordable and, X% tree canopy. If it's cheaper and it's easier, just.
Go ahead, Ms. Hara, or Ms. Tietze. Sorry.
I just wanted to bounce off two things. Mrs. Coleman made a really good point about a lot of those T-zone lots on North Washington are already commercial right now, including, is it the old office building that the city was in during the construction of City Hall? That is T-zone, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'd feel more comfortable if some of these, rather than, bringing them into this new T-zone, that they be rezoned as business, as they're being used for business now. Because I don't think, we do want to see townhouses there. And so I think some of that T-zone on North Washington really isn't acting as transition now anyway. It's acting as business, and it should stay as business. That's just my feeling on some of those lots. And then the other thing I was thinking about too, now if I can remember what I was thinking, gosh, I got off on my other problem here. On the affordable units, I wanted to go back to something that was said earlier, is that one of the reasons we don't have enough affordable units in the city is that we are not putting enough money to it, and we're not putting it, like, getting a little bit here and there, 10% here, 6% there, some of it goes away in 20 years or 30 years. If we really want to have like some real affordable housing on these T-zones, it would work best if we could put some money into it so that we could actually get what we wanted, which is to really bump up the affordability here. And at different levels, because we all know like 80%, 60% AMI, that's really not helping a lot of the people who work in the city. I mean, to really get housing in the city for people who work in the city, not just for our schools and stuff, but in our grocery stores and our shops, I mean, it almost has to be 40% AMI. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, and look at, we look at Seven Corners, at least for us in our business, we get people, none of our employees can live in the city. They all come in from out of the city. And like Seven Corners is a good example. Like Fairfax County wants to get rid of most of those garden-style apartments there with their plan. When that goes, that's a ton of affordable housing that's going to leave this area. And I have to believe a lot of our workers are coming from over there, maybe. So anyway, just something to think about, that if we really wanted it, we need to put some money into it.
Thank you, Commissioner Dietz. Commissioner Hara, go ahead.
Yeah, Melissa, I mean, exactly what you said is what I think needs to happen, and I think what we know needs to happen. Like, we can rezone all we want, but if we don't have more money to put into these developments to give to developers, they're not going to build affordable housing. And, Paul, you put up that one of the requirements was that it was going to increase the tax base, and we are rezoning in a way, if we do this, that increases density from what can go there now to what could go there. It will increase the tax base. So then why don't we just pull out some of that tax base for affordable housing? Do a linkage policy. So if you want the rezoning, the increased tax base that comes out of that rezoning gets linked directly into affordable housing fund that gets used where we just did the rezoning. That's how you get affordable housing. But you got to be willing to do that. And we just did a linked taxing plan on meals for a movie theater. Can we do it for this on affordable housing? And that's the question. And that's the question for the council. That's a question for us. But if we just do this rezoning without linking it to putting away some money for affordable housing, this will not lead to any affordable housing at all. So why do it then? I mean, I know a lot of people are talking about this as the missing middle, right? This is our little design for what Arlington is trying to do. But Arlington may do something big, but they won't get any affordable housing either because they're not linking it to greater funds for affordable housing. We have a much smaller town. We've got very few plots. Why don't we try this out? And I would propose, if we are going to do this rezoning, if it is not linked to increased funding for affordable housing, we don't do it. We don't do the rezoning. You can say transition this, that. No, we shouldn't do it. Because really all we're doing is increasing density in somebody's profitability. Why? If there's a purpose beyond just increasing, our tax base, it should be for, growth, for equitable growth. So link this potential tax base increase to increased money for affordable housing. That's equitable growth. So the other thing I would propose, if we don't want to do it based on that increased tax base for these T-zones, is that we just increase the meals tax overall for the city. I'd be happy to go out to eat in the city and contribute to affordable housing. If I possibly could do it, I'd love to put a tax on beer. Have a beer, increase affordable housing. That's a little bit trickier and harder. We probably couldn't even get that passed, but we absolutely can increase the meals tax in our town and have that money, a 1% increase, when we go out to dinner, to increase the affordable housing so more people have access to our community and can enjoy the amenities like a movie theater and other things that we will probably have in this town. So I just wanted, because I think we're kind of dancing around all these different things, but if we don't link this to increased money for affordable housing, we shouldn't do it.
Thank you, Commissioner Ira. Mr. Stevens, did you have your hand up?
Well, a little dancing around here. Just a couple of other things that kind of strike me as if I had my druthers. First of all, I agree with Mr. Puentes that the drive-through really does not seem like something that should be in this code. I understand why it is there, and maybe it has to stay there, but it really is, drive-throughs, I think, are just antithetical to pedestrian and biking, and if we're going to be heading in that direction, then we have to accompany it with good planning decisions, and drive-throughs I don't think fits into that equation. The other thing is just having parking lots as available by right just does not strike me as something that this group would probably agree with if they had the option to vote on that. So just a couple of things that occurred to me. If we can't do it here, we could put it on a parking lot list. Sorry about that. To handle at a future time. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Anybody else? More to add?
Just one thing to clarify. So, yes, the drive-through code happens to be in here, but you can't actually do a drive-through in a T-zone. It just happens to be that the supplemental regulations cover them. You can do drive-throughs in B1, but that's the regulations related to drive-throughs happen to be nested inside the same sections.
Okay. Well, I think we've given staff something to chew on. Well, and before this comes back, I mean, I think, I've heard many different comments. I mean, I think I don't know if I can even tease out some themes on this at this point, other than, I still think that, yeah, there seems to be I don't know if I see one main objective to doing this, other than there hasn't been a lot of development on these lots. So, maybe, other than to encourage something to happen, but I do agree with what I heard from, I think, a lot of the commissioners is, we're not looking just for development's sake, given, what we're looking for these zones to do. I think we need to be more direct about what we're looking to encourage here. And I would say that, I know ZOAC or whoever said that maybe we should have one T zone, but maybe not. I don't know, maybe there is a benefit to keeping the T2 and, having some different rules for what can happen on North Washington. I don't know. So, but I think perhaps that what would inform all of that, getting back to what I said was, looking at maybe drilling down a little bit more into what's going on these lots currently, and maybe really focusing on the lots that have development potential, because like I said, I think, it's already a small area we're talking about, and if you really go down to what is likely to redevelop, it's even smaller. And then it might give us a better sense of what's feasible and what is really best suited for those lots that are left, that actually do have redevelopment potential, that are underutilized today. I think that once we get down to that level, we're talking about a very small number. And we could, I'm not saying we should go lot by lot in the ordinance, but you're getting close to that level on some of these as far as what might make sense for them. And it's, maybe the area plan needs to look at that too, but, so, just next steps, Paul. We know November 2nd, we're going to have another kind of a public session to get more comments. Between now and then, I mean, was staff planning on providing any additional updates, or is staff kind of waiting till after that, and then there's a bigger gap in time?
No, I
Before
think
we
we've
take
got
this
to
up
keep it
again.
moving. We'll get to, well, I'll mention it later under the director's report, but the revisions to the T-zones is on the council's work plan, and I know they are interested in moving this along.
They asked about it, and they said, "Oh, what happened to the T-zones?"
Yeah,
We referred
internally, I'm
out.
getting some questions about sort of
I
what
know they asked me
what
about it,
staff
and I said,
doing
"Oh,
to-
yeah."
To sort of get this on agendas. So, one thing, right, and no jurisdiction is expected to solve the regional housing crisis or the national housing crisis for that matter. But I think every jurisdiction can do something to contribute. So, Falls Church, our own demographics chapter, talks about population growth continuing steadily through the year 2040, right? And people don't come from buildings. There's a whole different thing that creates people. And so it's not about sort of how many people are going to live in the region, but where are they going to be able to live. And so I think a lot of what's driving this conversation in jurisdictions throughout the region, right? DC pushing for more housing production, Arlington, and Falls Church, Fairfax, trying to right. This is sort of about sort of what smart growth is, right? It's not sort of pushing all the population growth to the outer jurisdictions where they're then sort of driving through the rest of the region to get where they need to go. So But by any stretch, I wouldn't say that this is meant to solve the regional housing crisis, but it is part of the toolkit for the city to allow for and to accommodate population growth in the region and try to do it in a smart way. In terms of next steps, I do want to try and keep the conversation moving. I am a big believer in active listening, so I think maybe the next step for staff, since the packet's due to you all in a fairly short time, I think what we might do is sort of take the comments we heard tonight. Obviously, we'll review those internally, and I think we'll probably separate them into sort of two broad categories, sort of what were the data requests we heard from commissioners in terms of the additional data information you need, whether that's research or comparables. And then the other bucket would be the recommendations that you all were making or the questions or concerns you had about the ordinance. And I think what we can do is think about those two buckets. We'll answer as many questions as we can on the data side, and then on the recommendation side, right, again, these aren't staff's recommendations to council, these are your all's recommendations to council. So what we'll do to facilitate the conversation is try to collect those comments that we heard made by multiple commissioners or were sort of linked concerns that really couldn't be separated, and try to highlight those to make sure that staff understands how to prepare your recommendations back to council. So I think that's the strategy we'll be able to get to for November.
Okay, that sounds like a reasonable plan. So we'll look forward to getting more information, and we'll pick this back up again on November the 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, well, and that's the work session for the evening, so moving along here. Taking us to information items, item 8, planning commissioners' reports. Anyone have any reports? Come on, go ahead.
I asked Mr. Trainer to add it to the information items, the materials, but the Virginia Tech Group, and Mr. Stevens might be able to speak to this even better than I can because he's been attending their meetings, but they submitted kind of an update on where they are with their review of the city's bike master plan. So it sounds like they've done a lot of really great work, and we should be able to expect to see something probably more concrete from them in the next few months, I think, or maybe by the end of the semester,
End of the year.
end of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've attended some of the early classes. I don't know if I'm going to be attending too many more at this point. They've kind of really got themselves launched, and I've kind of held myself out if they had questions, but they also have Carrie Odenino, better source than me, so I suspect that's the route that they will go. It really is a student-led effort. I think that's something for us to have our expectations in mind for. This is, even though, Ralph Bueller is the star attraction, he's led this class that it's the students' work, and so they've divided themselves up and are forming different areas of research and coming up with recommendations. But this will be very much their product, and I think we're all looking forward to it.
Definitely. There are a couple other things out of the CACT I wanted to mention they are starting to kind of take a look at reworking the neighborhood traffic calming program. So that's been a program that's had some good, really great projects happen, but can be kind of painful to work through, I think, both for staff and for residents. So they worked with Carrie O'Danino to take a look at doing a SWOT analysis of that at their most recent meeting. And one other thing that didn't come out of that meeting, but that I heard, maybe Mr. Stoddard, you can confirm this, but it sounds like the WNOD crossings are no longer going to be raised. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So that's what's in the latest engineered plan. So, oh gosh, this is, okay. So going back to the WNOD master plan.
Oh, you always leave out the late-breaking news.
There were, so as folks may remember, the WNOD master plan, when it was adopted by council with recommendation from the Planning Commission, there were major elements to refit that park. So it was getting the dual trails in, which is now being completed thanks to funding from the NVTA and completion by Nova Parks. The other major elements were landscaping. Initially, the plan was to do a nice row of sort of understory canopy trees, a lot of flowering trees to really mark the edges of the park and make clear what is the park space versus private land. I think today a lot of people are afraid to walk off the trail. They think they're trespassing. No, you could probably go another 40 feet before you even start trespassing. That played out a little differently. What's been done with the planting plan is a native meadow mix to try and encourage pollinators and really sort of a restorative landscape. The other elements were lighting. So that people have access to the park. In months like, winter months like now, the park is open well after dark, and people don't get out of work earlier just because the sun goes down sooner. And so the idea was to make sure the park was open and safe during operating hours. We have a 30% lighting plan, but we continue to look for funding to get that done. The plazas, the way stations where you could do wayfinding, have seating, some benches, really tell the story of the park and the people that made it happen. We have permission from Nova Park to install them. We have some funding available, but it's sort of locked behind sort of a staffing issue. And then the fifth element is the crossings, which was your actual question. So the crossings were really supposed to emphasize the park-like feel, right? And the reason I went through the other elements is to really highlight this was really supposed to be one of the city's great parks. It's 16 acres of land. It's actually bigger than Cherry Hill Park when you count it all out. And so really it was to emphasize, yes, this is the trail and it's a throughway, but it's also a park and a place that people enjoy within the community as well. So the crossings were really supposed to emphasize that park design, that the streets actually exist by easement, not by any means of right. And so the idea was to emphasize that with raised crossings, special materials, decorative landscaping, appropriate lighting. We do have the lighting, we do have the decorative materials, we do have the separated crossings, but ultimately we didn't end up with the raised crossings. Although if we were to flip the switch, what we're going to have is lowered crossings, right? You might say that the sidewalk is at grade and the street is lowered. But no, that the crossings will remain at the street grade. When that was looked at early in the engineering stages, there was a lot of consideration for how to get stormwater to properly flow over those crossings. And ultimately, I think concerns just couldn't be satisfied internally. And so the direction was to keep the crossings at their current grade.
I would say that's really unfortunate because I had fully bought into your vision of this idea of people driving on the street, going up and over these crossings and having the feeling of really passing through the park. So I think that's a real loss.
Yep.
And really, I mean, I would hope that, maybe our engineers could go back and take a harder look at this, because I think it really is worth doing. And I know other people have figured it out in other places. I know not all those places aren't, these particular places, but this seems to come up a lot whenever we're trying to do raised crossings. And so it seems like something we need to figure out, because other jurisdictions are able to do them. So I'm not sure why it's so hard.
Well, it's surprising too, because these crossings, I presume because it's old railroad bed, that it's the high point. So water's going to be going
Well,
away from that anyway.
So interestingly, they're actually usually the low point, because the railroad typically follows the stream bed. So the stream bed is in the valley. And so it ends up being actually at a low point in the local street grid often. I was very frustrated that we couldn't get them to be raised. I do think we have some good design elements that are still going to give that a park feeling. For example, today, the street doesn't change width as it goes through the park, and we were able to get that narrowed in. So there will be space, certainly sufficient space for cars and even emergency vehicles to go through the park, but there won't be extra width out there for people to park cars and things like that within the crossing space. We were able to get the special materials to continue to almost the full extent of the park. So there will be, almost a 30-foot approach of special materials as people come to the crossing. So I think the combination of lighting, which will be certainly much better than what is out there today, because we're properly lighting the crossings now. So you'll have lighting, you'll have the narrowed approaches, you'll also have the special materials. I think that combination is going to be effective. I think it would have been better with the raised crossings, but I still think it's going to be good. And it's going to be certainly a lot better than what we have now.
I agree, it will be definitely a lot better, but too bad it couldn't be the full 100% vision.
I will take that message back.
Thanks.
Okay, any other commissioner updates? Mr. Stevens?
Yeah, I attended the joint AAB-CACT meeting where they went over the East Area Plan, which obviously is of interest to us. I won't go through those points now. I think it'd be better, I can kind of summarize some, they made some good points, but I think it'd be better to summarize them when we have this issue back before us. The only other thing I wanted to mention was at the city council meeting on Monday, where they talked about the SESP for the senior building up at West Falls. The developer did agree to make the residences all electric, which is one of the things that we asked for, so I was pleased to hear that. And also the developer agreed to the 20% improvement of energy efficiency below the LEED baseline. So I was also pleased to hear that. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, not seeing any other reports. I guess that will take us to the director's report. Mr. Stoddard.
Sure. Thank you, Chair and members of the commission. And I apologize for this. We have a bit of a glitch in our posting this week, but I'll get you the missing materials at your next meeting. So we did include in your written report, there's what we're calling the 5-year outlook presentation. This is the years 2022 to 2027. So sort of independently, we received outreach from first the League of Women Voters and then subsequently the Chamber of Commerce to provide presentations to those two groups about ongoing development activity and community investments. These were both requests were spurred by the walking tour of the Park Ave Great Streets project, and so they wanted to know what else was going on in terms of development and transportation. The slides which were attached focus on those two questions because that's what the groups were interested in. And so I was, with a lot of help from staff, especially from Cameron Garris, who pulled together the materials, I was able to make both the presentations at the close of September there to the Chamber of Commerce, September 20th, and the League of Women Voters, September 29th. And the slides that went out to the League of Women Voters are attached for your information. But it's a walkthrough of what is the city's overall vision per the comprehensive plan, the stitched together vision of the small area plans, what development has happened recently, and then what's coming up. And because it was that 5-year window, and I chuckled a little bit because the chamber referred to that as their long-term view, and I said, well, for planners, that's kind of like tomorrow. But because it's 5 years, we were able to clarify, these projects either are under construction or they are entitled, so there's a pretty good sense of certainty about what's going to happen development-wise in the next 5 years, at least in terms of major development. And also the city's CIP covers 5 years, it was 6 years, so there's certainty about that time frame. So it was a nice presentation, and I wanted to make sure you all had a copy of it. Something else that...
Also, you did a good job in presenting it, so.
Thank you. It was fun. It was like the old days. Just two things to highlight. One, I'll go ahead and report now. We did make two recent new hires in the planning shop. Two new principal planners came on staff. Laura Arsenault and Henry Zhang both joined the city staff recently on September 26th and October 10th, respectively. They'll be filling gaps in our staffing and covering some.
Laura was stolen from Fairfax, but she's really great, and we're glad that she's here in town. She's awesome. I
Like
don't-
you guys haven't stolen from us.
Well, we have. It was a fair trade.
Carly
I
Aubrey?
said it was a fair trade for Carly Aubrey. A very fair trade. So we're lucky to have Laura join us. I don't know the other planner. I'm sure he's great too. But Laura,
Yeah.
I know very well. I've known her for over a decade. She's great.
Yeah, so they're both coming to the city with 15 to 20 years experience in city planning, and really, once you get up to that level, obviously, you've seen a wide variety of projects in terms of complexity and type, but current planning, future planning, zoning enforcement, architecture review, and so it really is a tremendous boost to our team to have both those planners. And you'll see them covering some of the larger mixed-use projects, teaming up on Broad and Washington, West Falls, but then also helping with zoning enforcement and other related zoning updates. The other thing we I guess we forgot to post for you. Also, we'll have it next time. There is now so the city manager's office is doing a combined report on the council's work plan and the CIP on a quarterly basis. So as you all may remember, the council adopted a 2-year work plan with not only a list of work items, but a schedule for getting those things accomplished. And Wyatt and Cindy provided updates on those work plan items as well as major CIP projects at the council's October 11th meeting. And so I'll include that report in your next packet for your November meeting. And that might be a better time to walk through some of those items and the things specifically related to the Planning Commission in terms of active as well as upcoming. I should walk through the schedule. I'm sorry, I always, sometimes I forget to do this. Just in terms of your look ahead, T-zones is the one item. I'm sorry, you've got 2 items on your November schedule. You've got T-zones, the public listening session, as well as staff's sort of reflection of comments tonight, and then the CIP kickoff. So this is part of sort of an evolving process to try and get the Planning Commission involved earlier in development of the CIP. So there will be no draft CIP for your review, but instead there will be a report to you on what is the status of implementing the current CIP. We'll also provide updated versions of the comprehensive plan and small area plan report cards. And so the hope is that you all will be able to provide direction to staff in developing the CIP before we head into that in the fall and winter months. Then we'll be moving into our sort of end of year cycle. We'll be distributing, as we have for the last couple of years, our annual Planning Commission service survey. We'll ask you how staff is doing in terms of providing good information to you, timely information. That's an exercise I always enjoy doing. I like getting better. We'll also provide a draft annual report that you all would be providing to council later the beginning of the year. And then there may be a development application coming to you. This is tentative. The Byron has come in and requested an amendment to their retail restrictions. They are proposing to hold on to the restaurant and retail sales operations in the sort of leftmost bays, the Harveys and the Penzies, and they're looking for flexibility to a wider range of B uses in the other retail bays. As part of the application, they're also proposing to standardize their parking with a parking management plan. Back in the day when Byron was initially approved, there was no parking management plan, and so they're going to they're offering a proposed parking management plan that would clarify which spaces are commercial, which ones are residential, and also how those commercial spaces should be managed in terms of 15-minute parking, 1-hour parking, and so on. That has yet to be referred out to council, so that's really just a heads up that may be coming your way. Let's see, the T-zone schedule we already talked about as part of that item, and then the Tinner Hill rezoning. This is also a project being led up by Jack Trainer, but this goes back to an issue that was flagged in one of the school's equity reports. And we'll certainly provide some additional background on the history of development along Hillwood Avenue as well as South Washington Street. The property ownership traditionally being an African-American-owned area of the city, but landing with a B3 zoning district instead of a residential zoning district like most of the other single-family houses in the city. And so it is a council request for council for staff to pursue a rezoning of those properties to get them rezoned to be R1A or R1B, whatever the lot size fits. So we'll be bringing that to you hopefully in December. Let's see, small area plan, it was mentioned earlier in the commission reports, that is going out to all the boards and commissions now over the next couple months. We'll also be holding our second community meeting. I think we've got that date for mid-November. I can get that on your schedule at your next packet. And hoping to come back to Planning Commission in December so that we can give you a report out on what we heard from the boards and commissions as well as the community. We also have an online survey that we'll be launching within the next week or so to collect feedback on that draft plan. Just an update on the West Falls project since it was mentioned. Yes, the senior housing component, which is the last building of Phase 1, is before council. It's scheduled for final consideration next Monday. You all had previously made a positive recommendation to council on that SESP, and so that is now before council for final action. I think that wraps up my report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stoddard. Oh, Mr. Hara has a comment. Go ahead.
Paul, I just had one question on your presentation that you made in September. I see that the One City Center is still on there. Is that still under consideration, or has that been pulled?
So the last sort of steps on that application, you all may remember the application was before you for your recommendation to council. You did make a positive recommendation, and then the applicant was revising their materials to incorporate direction from the Planning Commission as well as other boards and commissions. And then they are, I think in phone calls with them, they're projects that weren't far enough along in the entitlement process are really being hit by increasing construction costs. And so I think they're sort of reevaluating that project to figure out whether it's worthwhile to move forward at this time or whether they need to wait for another window.
Okay.
I have a question. Well, I had two, but you asked my One City Center, because I was hearing too that financing was an issue and that we may see that go somewhere other way. I was hoping I'd see some information on it, but do we know what's going on with the Florist Virginia Inn building that's being remodeled? Because I thought
Sure.
usually EDA sends out a report and you see something, but I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, it's
EDO, no.
so it's a renovation. It's a by right renovation. So right, there are various triggers for site plans, which is obviously what would bring it before you all. Increases in building square footage, land disturbance, things of that nature. But they're leaving parking lots as parking lots, and they're leaving buildings as buildings. So the proposal. I shouldn't even say proposal, it's what they're working through. So it's to put in it'll be a commercial kitchen space or a space supported by a commercial kitchen, so it may be a baker or a small cafe would take over the old Florist building, and then they'd have a number of outdoor seating areas on a rear patio, sort of in the, oh, right, we're all in person, so I can use my hands. I'm so used to Teams, I'm sorry. But there's a crook in the building that the hotel goes a little bit deeper than the old Florist building, so within that crook, they'd be able to put some outdoor dining. And so I think they're thinking that would be a fun dining experience. They're also putting some dining on the front of the building, and then the hotel itself gets renovated and continues to operate as a hotel. They're also looking at ways, I think, to connect the two parking bays in the back. So right now, there's only one way into each of those parking bays, which can be a little awkward. So I think I think the proposal is to open that access up, allow for a little more circulation, and you sort of avoid the need to hunt for parking in two different lots.
Do you know, are they going to relabel that hotel?
I don't know what operator they'll be under.
Oh, okay, I'm just curious because it wasn't exactly the nicest.
Right.
So it'd be kind of nice. It would be interesting if they made it something kind of eclectic and fun to kind of go with the new look, because it definitely looks much more attractive.
Yes. They're obviously putting a nice investment into the building, right? I mean, things that should be square will be square, and things that should be painted will be.
Okay. All right. Well, that takes us just finally to some items of correspondence. We don't have to go through those directly, but we had a letter from Anna and Mort Dworkin, who apparently think that Park Avenue should just be good and not great. I'll leave it at that. Bike Falls Church, which sounds like a car group, no, just kidding, sent us a nice letter about what they're doing, and I know there's some members of the commission that are involved with that group.
I do think that their asks were really spot on. They had 6 things that they asked for, to have happen, and I thought they all made sense to me.
No, absolutely. It's so it sounds like it's a group that's started organically and kind of grown, and certainly a lot of our work and our things we've pushed for are in line with what they're pushing for. So, so good to see that. And then, lastly, we had a letter from VPIS on the library and some changes they'd like to see with their operations. So,
Currently, the library has a survey out asking for opinions, and they're also doing some like listen-in sessions. So this is actively happening right now. If you have any thoughts about the library, you should go to their website. You probably can find a link to their survey.
okay.
I meant to mention too that the Virginia Tech Group also has a survey, and they're interviewing city residents about their experiences biking around town. So I'll see if I can get the link to the survey.
Cool. Very good. All right, well, that takes us to the end. Unless there's any other final parting comments or words of wisdom, we will call this meeting adjourned as of 9:27.